Now, I invite you to close your eyes, put on your headset, and imagine yourself fully immersed in the world of this story. Let the words paint vivid pictures in your mind, and feel the suspense, excitement, and emotions of every moment. Once you've experienced it, drop a comment and let me know how it felt for you. Was it gripping? Did you feel the tension building up? Share your thoughts with me. I'd love to hear how it affected you. Madison Porter had always lived in a world of luxury, a world where money meant power and power meant freedom. From the moment she was born, her father's wealth protected her from the consequences of her actions. A broken car? No problem. Daddy would cover it. Ruining someone's life? Daddy would fix that too. Madison didn't have to worry about the little things that normal people did. She had the golden ticket, and it worked every time. Her father's billions made everything go away, and Madison knew it. She had grown up surrounded by people who didn't question her or her family. They all knew that if you had money, you had power. And if you had power, you could do anything. One evening, as she stood in front of her mirror, Madison snapped another selfie. She was dressed in a designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled, and the light of her walk-in closet made her look like she had stepped straight out of a magazine. The closet was massive, with racks of expensive clothes and shelves, lined with shoes that cost more than most people's rent. Madison couldn't help but smile. She loved the attention she received online, and her millions of followers were always there to shower her with praise. Another day, another closet tour, she said to the camera, holding her phone at the perfect angle. Her voice was sweet, almost innocent, as she panned across the rows of luxury handbags and shoes. Behind her, her maid, Maria, was busy organizing the cashmere sweaters on the shelf. Maria moved quickly to stay out of frame, but Madison wasn't paying attention to her. She was too busy enjoying the moment. Daddy just got back from Paris, and guess what? He brought me something special. Madison continued, lifting a pristine white Hermes box into the frame. She pretended to be surprised, even though she had already seen the gift earlier. In a careless move, Madison knocked over the neatly organized pile of sweaters, not even glancing at the mess she made. "Oops," she giggled, not bothered in the slightest. "Sorry, not sorry." Maria, who had worked for the Porter family for years, silently rearranged the sweaters, trying to stay out of the camera's view. She knew better than to complain. She had learned long ago that in Madison's world, she was just an accessory, nothing more. Madison loved this life. She loved the attention. She loved the power that came with her name. No one questioned her because they knew better. The Porter family was untouchable. The more people praised her on social media, the more she believed she could do anything. But that belief was about to be shattered. It all started when Madison got behind the wheel of her Porsche, racing through the streets of Boston. She was in a hurry, as usual. After all, she had a reputation to maintain. But this time, her speed didn't go unnoticed. She hit Tyrann Walker, an innocent man, leaving him bleeding on the sidewalk. His leg was shattered, and he was left to die in the rain. Yet Madison wasn't concerned about the man she had just hurt. Instead, she took a picture of her Porsche, showing off a small scratch on the side of her car. "Oops," she posted, adding a caption about how she'd ruined her favorite car. The arrogance in her post was clear. The world could see it, but no one cared, or so Madison thought. She was used to getting away with things. After all, her father would fix it, just like he always did. She laughed at the thought, scrolling through the comments from her followers, who were all too happy to sympathize with her. But there was one thing Madison didn't realize. This time, her father's money wouldn't be enough. The case landed on the desk of Judge Desmond Cole, a man who had spent years watching the Porters and other wealthy families treat justice like a joke. He had seen how the elite in Boston used their money to erase mistakes, to buy silence from judges, and to crush anyone who dared to speak out. For 15 years, Judge Cole had watched the corruption unfold, and he had waited. Now he had his chance to change things. As soon as the case involving Madison Porter came across his desk, Judge Cole knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. He could already picture Madison strutting into the courtroom, her usual air of invincibility surrounding her. But Judge Cole wasn't like the other judges she had faced. He wasn't going to be swayed by her wealth or her followers. Madison didn't know it yet, but the power had shifted. She had entered a courtroom where money couldn't buy the outcome, and no amount of selfies or Instagram likes could save her. Judge Cole had spent years gathering evidence, preparing to take down the corrupt empire that had ruled Boston. And Madison Porter, for all her fame and privilege, was about to be the face of that downfall. As she made her way to the courtroom, live streaming the entire event to her millions of followers, she had no idea that her reign of consequence-free chaos was about to come to an end. This time, money couldn't protect her. Justice had finally caught up with Madison Porter, and Judge Desmond Cole was determined to make sure the world saw it. The camera cut away from Madison's confident smile to the serious face of Judge Cole, who was preparing for the battle ahead. For the first time in her life, Madison would face the consequences of her actions, and the world was about to watch. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as Madison Porter walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. Her millions of followers were watching live, their comments flooding the screen as they cheered her on, unaware that they were about to witness a battle of a very different kind. Madison flashed a smile, her usual confidence radiating as she strode toward the defendant's seat, her phone raised in the air for yet another selfie. Madison Porter, the social media queen, the influencer who can do no wrong, Judge Desmond Cole thought, his eyes narrowing as he watched her swagger into the room. For years, he had watched the world cater to people like her, people who thought they were above the law because their money could erase their mistakes. But today, he wasn't going to let that happen. Madison sat down with a flick of her perfectly manicured fingers, completely at ease as she adjusted her phone to catch the best angles. Her followers were eating it up, commenting on how fabulous she looked and praising her style. The air was thick with tension as the judge called the court to order. "Miss Porter," Judge Cole began, his voice firm and calm. "You're here today because of an incident involving Mr. Terran Walker, a man who you struck with your vehicle, leaving him to die in the streets. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Madison glanced up from her phone, a bored expression on her face. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said with a shrug, her voice carrying an air of nonchalance. "I was just driving, and accidents happen. But it's not a big deal. My dad's already taking care of it." The room fell silent, except for the rapid clicking of Madison's phone as she tried to capture the perfect courtroom selfie. The audacity of her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Judge Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't let it show. He had prepared for this moment, and he wasn't going to let her dismiss the gravity of the situation. "Is that so?" Judge Cole asked, his voice cool but piercing. "You think that simply because your father's money can clean up your mess, you don't have to face the consequences? That's where you're wrong, Miss Porter." Madison raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. She had never been questioned like this before. The usual suspects, her friends, her followers, would never dare to challenge her. She was used to being the queen of the scene, always in control, always the center of attention. But this time, the rules were different. Judge Cole continued, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You may think your father's wealth can buy anything, Miss Porter, but it can't buy the truth. It can't buy justice, and it definitely can't buy me." Madison's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. She adjusted her phone, taking yet another picture. She refused to let anyone see how uneasy she was. After all, she was Madison Porter. Nothing could touch her. But as the judge's words sank in, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. There was something in the way Judge Cole spoke, a calm determination in his voice that made Madison pause. For the first time, she felt something she wasn't familiar with: uncertainty. The prosecution began presenting evidence, showing photos of the scene where Terren Walker had been left in the rain, his legs shattered, and his body broken. His pain was palpable in the images, his blood staining the concrete where he had been left to die. Madison's followers were watching every moment, commenting with their usual excitement and support, but there was a quiet murmur from the crowd in the courtroom. The gravity of the situation was starting to settle in. "Madison, look at the screen," Judge Cole said, gesturing to the evidence. "This is the man you hurt. This is the life you disrupted. Can you still claim that it's not a big deal?" Madison looked at the image for a moment, but it wasn't the photo of the broken man that caught her attention. It was the look in Judge Cole's eyes. There was no fear, no intimidation. He wasn't swayed by her wealth, her beauty, or her social media following. He was a man who had spent years watching the powerful exploit the system, and now he had the chance to make a difference. He wasn't going to let Madison get away with it. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time, Madison felt a creeping doubt in the back of her mind. She had spent her whole life using her father's power to escape consequences, but now she was faced with something she had never encountered before, someone who wouldn't back down. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a 1,000-pound burden. Her followers were still cheering her on, but in the back of her mind, Madison couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this time she wasn't going to get away with it. Judge Cole wasn't done. "This is your opportunity, Miss Porter. You can either face the consequences of your actions and show the world that you're more than just your father's money, or you can continue to live in a bubble of privilege, pretending that nothing matters." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "What will it be?" Madison opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she didn't know what to say. The room seemed to close in on her, the silence growing louder by the second. The truth was, Madison had never been faced with a choice like this, and as Judge Cole's gaze remained unwavering, Madison realized that the power she had always relied on was slipping through her fingers. She wasn't untouchable anymore, and the consequences of her actions were finally about to catch up with her. Madison shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Fear. It was subtle at first, just a flutter in the pit of her stomach. But it quickly grew into a gnawing, unsettling feeling. She was used to being in control, always the one who dictated the terms, always the one with the power to make things go away. But not this time. Not with Judge Cole. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. She glanced down at her phone, seeing the flood of supportive comments from her followers. "You've got this, Maddie," one of them wrote. "Daddy will fix it. #justice for Madison." Another wrote, "Haters gonna hate. Keep shining, girl." But despite all the praise and encouragement from her online fans, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't as invincible as she thought. Judge Cole's words echoed in her mind, pulling her attention back to the present. "What will it be, Miss Porter?" His voice was firm, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "The world is watching. Will you own up to your actions, or will you continue to hide behind your wealth?" For a moment, Madison couldn't speak. It was as if the whole courtroom had suddenly gone silent, even though she could still hear the clicking of cameras and the murmurs from the crowd. Her fingers twitched nervously, the phone in her hand suddenly feeling too heavy. Her father's money had always been her safety net. Whenever things went wrong, whenever her actions had consequences, Daddy was always there with a check or a phone call to make everything disappear. She was untouchable. She had always been untouchable. But now, sitting in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers who didn't care about her social media following or her father's money, Madison realized something she had never truly considered. She was not invincible. The judge's piercing gaze never wavered, and it was as if his eyes were digging into her soul. He had seen it all before: the rich, the powerful, those who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But Judge Cole wasn't like the others. He wasn't interested in Madison's social media clout or her designer wardrobe. He wanted something far more important: accountability. Madison took a deep breath, trying to gather herself. She was Madison Porter, after all, the influencer, the queen of Boston's elite. She wasn't about to let one man ruin her life. She'd been through worse, right? A little courtroom drama wasn't going to take her down. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. She couldn't pretend anymore. Judge Cole had exposed her, had forced her to face the reality that her money couldn't protect her from everything. As the prosecution continued to present evidence, photos of the broken man, Taran Walker, his shattered leg and blood staining the sidewalk, Madison's mind began to spin. She had thought it would all be over in a few hours, that her father's money would take care of it as usual. But this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something bigger, something more terrifying: justice. Madison tried to tune out the rest of the proceedings, but Judge Cole's next words snapped her back to reality. "Miss Porter, you may have a large following online, but this isn't a popularity contest," Judge Cole said, his voice cold but steady. "You cannot buy your way out of this. The law is the law, and no one is above it, not even you." The words stung, and for the first time, Madison felt a twinge of panic. Her phone, once her greatest asset, now felt like a weight in her hand. She looked down at it, staring at her reflection in the screen. Was this the end of her reign? The end of her carefully crafted empire? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her father's voice booming through the courtroom door. "Madison," he called, striding in with his usual air of authority. "What's going on here?" "We'll fix this, I promise." Her heart sank. She had been counting on him, on his ability to make everything disappear, like he always did. But something in Judge Cole's unwavering gaze told her this time would be different. Her father's money might have worked on everyone else, but it wouldn't work on this judge. "Your father can't help you here, Miss Porter," Judge Cole said, his voice echoing through the room. "This isn't about wealth. This is about right and wrong, and I'll make sure the truth comes out." Madison's world was spinning. She had always been able to navigate life with ease, using her beauty, her popularity, and her father's power to get whatever she wanted. But this moment, the weight of her actions, the eyes of the world on her, was unlike anything she had ever faced. She looked around at the courtroom, her gaze falling on the faces of those who had witnessed her arrogance. The prosecution, the judge, the audience, they were all waiting for her to make a choice. The choice between continuing her facade of perfection or owning up to what she had done. For the first time, Madison felt her confidence waver. Her father's money, her social media followers, her designer wardrobe, they didn't matter here. In this moment, she wasn't the queen of Boston's elite. She was just another person facing the consequences of her actions. And as she sat there, caught between the world she had known and the reality she now faced, Madison realized that her life was about to change. The question was, would she change with it, or would she continue to cling to the illusion that nothing could touch her? The tension in the room grew thicker, and for the first time in her life, Madison Porter didn't know what would happen next. The minutes ticked by like hours as Madison sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Her father's voice, booming with authority just moments ago, had faded into the background. It felt like the world was closing in on her. No matter how many times she tried to push the thoughts away, they kept creeping back. This is real. This time, there's no escaping. Her father's money, her social media clout, her designer wardrobe, all of it seemed so trivial now. It was like a mask that had just cracked, and behind it was the raw, vulnerable truth she had never truly acknowledged. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional rustle of papers or the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Madison felt every eye on her, the weight of all the judgment, all the scrutiny, bearing down on her. She had always been the one in control, the one who held the power. But now she was the one on trial. And it wasn't just her actions that were under examination, it was her entire life. As the prosecution continued to lay out the facts, her mind wandered back to the night of the accident. The night when everything changed. She had been driving too fast, too recklessly, her mind clouded by the adrenaline of the moment. Tyrone Walker hadn't stood a chance. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Madison didn't even remember the details of the crash. Just the sickening thud of her car hitting something, followed by the chaotic rush to post a selfie about her minor injury. The scratch on her Porsche seemed so much more important than the bleeding man left behind in the rain. But now, sitting in the courtroom, those memories came crashing back. She could almost hear Tyrone scream as he crumpled to the ground. She could almost see his face, contorted in pain and fear, before the darkness swallowed him up. Madison squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block the images, but they kept coming. His face, his legs shattered, the blood that had stained the street. All of it because of her. And the worst part, she had never truly cared. Not until now. Her father, as powerful as he was, wasn't here to fix things. Not this time. Madison had lived her whole life in the belief that consequences were for other people. For the poor, the powerless, the ones who didn't have the luxury of buying their way out of trouble. But now, as she sat in front of Judge Cole, the harsh reality was sinking in. There were no checks to write this time, no calls to make, no way to erase the damage she had caused. Miss Porter, Judge Cole's voice broke through her thoughts. It was firm, unyielding. I've listened to your lawyer's arguments. I've seen the evidence. But the question remains, what will you do now? The courtroom held its breath as Madison slowly stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She wasn't used to feeling this way. Uncertain, vulnerable. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the narrative. But now, in front of a judge who wasn't going to bend to her whims, Madison had no idea what to say. She turned to face Judge Cole, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't just playing to an audience of adoring fans or her father's friends. There was no camera to focus on her perfectly styled hair or the designer dress she wore. There were no hashtags or filters to make everything seem perfect. This was real. This was the truth. Madison began, her voice faltering as she tried to form the words. For a moment, the words seemed to get stuck in her throat, tangled up in the lies she had spent her whole life telling herself. She had always justified her actions. She had always found a way to make her mistakes seem insignificant. But now, with the entire courtroom watching, the reality of it hit her like a ton of bricks. I'm sorry, she finally whispered, the words coming out in a rush. She didn't even know if the apology meant anything. How could it? She had spent so many years hurting people, dismissing their pain, using her privilege to walk away from consequences. But maybe, just maybe, this apology could be the first step toward making things right. Judge Cole looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Sorry isn't enough, Miss Porter. Not this time. His words stung, but they were true. Apologies couldn't undo what had been done. They couldn't erase the pain she had caused. And in this courtroom, surrounded by people who didn't care about her fame or her wealth, Madison had to face the truth for the first time in her life. The weight of that truth was crushing. Her father's presence in the courtroom had always been a source of comfort, a shield, a guarantee that things would turn out the way she wanted. But now, as she glanced over at him sitting silently in the back, she saw something she had never noticed before. He wasn't the all-powerful man she had always believed him to be. He was just a man, and even he couldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions. The thought was terrifying. As Madison stood there, her heart racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and regret, she realized something that shook her to the core. For the first time, she didn't want her money, her followers, or her father's influence. What she wanted was redemption. What she wanted was a chance to make things right. But she didn't know if she deserved that chance. And as Judge Cole prepared to deliver his verdict, Madison knew that her life was about to change forever. There was no going back now. The courtroom was silent as Madison stood there, her heart racing. Judge Cole's eyes never left her, piercing through her facade, searching for the truth she had spent so many years hiding. For the first time in her life, Madison felt small, completely exposed. She had spent years living in a bubble, surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, where her father's money could fix anything. But now, in this moment, none of that mattered. The air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. Madison glanced toward her father, sitting quietly at the back, his face unreadable. His presence, once a source of comfort and security, now felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. He wasn't going to fix this. He couldn't. No amount of money, no number of favors could change the reality that was unfolding. Judge Cole cleared his throat, and Madison instinctively straightened, trying to regain some composure. But it was hard. The shame she felt was overwhelming, sinking deeper with every passing second. She wanted to run, to escape the truth that was being thrust upon her. But she knew there was no running anymore. There was no place to hide. "Miss Porter," Judge Cole began, his voice calm but firm, "you stand before this court today, not as the social media queen you've so carefully crafted yourself to be, but as a person who has caused harm. You have spent years evading accountability, hiding behind your father's money and your social media persona. But the harm you've caused can no longer be ignored." Madison's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a blow to her chest. She had always been so sure of herself, so confident that she could get away with anything. But now, the reality was setting in. She wasn't untouchable. She wasn't invincible. There were consequences, and she was finally facing them. Judge Cole continued, "The accident you caused that night, when you left Taran Walker bleeding in the street, was not a mere accident. It was a choice. A reckless, thoughtless choice. And while you may think the consequences for your actions can be erased with a check or a hashtag, the law doesn't work that way. Your privilege doesn't change the fact that someone was hurt, someone's life was shattered, because of your actions." Madison swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had never seen things this way before. She had always been able to write off her mistakes, dismiss the lives she ruined, with a flick of her finger on her phone screen. But now, with the judge's words hanging in the air, the truth was undeniable. She had been wrong. However, Judge Cole added, his voice growing more serious, "I am not here to punish you for the sake of punishment. I am here to ensure that justice is served. You must understand that there are consequences for what you have done. The court cannot simply let you walk away, as you have done so many times before." Madison's hands trembled in her lap as she struggled to stay calm. The thought of facing real consequences was terrifying. She had never been held accountable before. She had always been able to turn to her father, to her followers, to erase the mistakes. But now, she was on her own. The sentence, Judge Cole paused, letting the words sink in, will not be a simple fine, nor will it be something that can be undone with a donation to charity. You have shown no remorse, no true understanding of the damage you've caused, and for that, you will be required to face the consequences. Madison's stomach dropped. She had been bracing herself for this moment, but hearing it out loud, hearing the finality in Judge Cole's voice, was something else entirely. It was real. This was happening. She was about to lose everything. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing inward. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom felt like 1,000 tiny daggers, all trained on her. She could feel her father's eyes, too, boring into her from the back of the room. His silence spoke volumes. He had always been her protector, her shield from the world. But now, there was no shield. There was no protection. As Judge Cole continued to speak, Madison's thoughts started to blur together. The words faded, drowned out by the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had always been able to control the narrative, always been able to manipulate the world around her, but not anymore. The truth was unfolding, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Miss Porter," Judge Cole's voice broke through her haze, "you will be sentenced to community service, rehabilitation, and a public apology to Taran Walker. You will also face a substantial fine, which will be donated to a charity for victims of reckless driving. But more importantly, you will be required to spend the next year learning the true meaning of accountability. Your days of living in a bubble of privilege are over. The words hit Madison like a punch to the gut. She couldn't breathe. She had always been the one to call the shots, to decide her own fate. But now, for the first time, the world was telling her what to do. She wasn't in control anymore, and it was terrifying. As the gavel slammed down, marking the end of the hearing, Madison felt a wave of panic wash over her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't how her life was supposed to be. But in that moment, she understood something she had never understood before. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, and no amount of money, no number of followers, could ever change that. The court was dismissed, and Madison slowly rose from her seat. Her legs felt like they were made of jelly, and her mind was reeling. She had been sentenced, and now she would have to face the real world, the one where she wasn't a social media queen, but just another person who had to answer for her mistakes. As she left the courtroom, the weight of the sentence settled on her shoulders. She was no longer untouchable. The world she had built for herself was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was no turning back. The days following the verdict felt like a blur to Madison Porter. The world she had so carefully crafted, a world filled with designer clothes, luxury cars, and millions of Instagram followers, was crumbling. The sentence Judge Cole had handed down to her was more than just a punishment. It was a wake-up call. For the first time, Madison was forced to confront the reality of her actions, and it was a reality she had been avoiding for years. Her first day of community service felt like a cruel joke. Madison had always been pampered, treated like royalty by her father and the people around her. But now, as she stood in a small, overcrowded shelter, sorting through donated clothes and cleaning floors, the weight of her privilege seemed suffocating. She was used to being above this, above everything. But now, there was no escaping it. Madison tried to distract herself by checking her phone, but the notifications flooded in, reminding her of the life she had lost. Her followers were unfollowing her at an alarming rate, the once glowing comments turning into insults and criticism. She had become a target, no longer the untouchable social media queen she once was. It was hard to ignore, hard to accept. But deep down, Madison knew she had brought this upon herself. The hours passed slowly, and the reality of her new life set in. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, she could somehow talk her way out of the situation. She had always been able to get by on charm, on the allure of her wealth and beauty. But now, no one cared about her looks. No one cared about the picture-perfect life she had portrayed for so long. They only saw a person who had caused harm, who had used her father's money to escape accountability for too long. As the day wore on, Madison found herself growing increasingly agitated. She had been forced to give up her luxurious life for this. For the first time, she felt out of control. Her father wasn't there to fix it. He had tried, of course, but even his money couldn't erase what had been done. Madison had no one to blame but herself. But there was something else nagging at her. Deep down, buried beneath the layers of anger and resentment, was a small seed of realization. Maybe, just maybe, this was what she needed. Maybe this was the lesson she had refused to learn for so long. Madison had always lived her life with a sense of entitlement, thinking that the world owed her something. But now, as she stood in the midst of the chaos she had caused, she was beginning to see that entitlement wasn't the answer. The money, the fame, the followers, none of it mattered. The things she had once valued most were suddenly worthless in the face of true consequence. As the sun began to set, Madison found herself sitting on a bench outside the shelter, staring at the city around her. It was the same city she had grown up in, the same city where her father's influence had once made her feel like she was invincible. But now it felt different. The world seemed colder, more distant, as if it had moved on without her. For the first time, Madison felt like an outsider in her own life. her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "You're not a bad person," a woman said from behind her. Madison turned to see one of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, standing a few feet away. Madison's first instinct was to brush her off, to tell her that she didn't need her pity. But something in the woman's gaze made her pause. She had heard those words before, from people who didn't truly understand. But this woman, she seemed different. She wasn't offering sympathy or excuses. She was simply acknowledging her humanity. Madison didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many years hiding behind her image, behind the persona she had carefully constructed for social media. She had built walls around herself, walls that kept people out. But now, with nowhere left to hide, she felt exposed, raw. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Madison wasn't sure who she was anymore. "I know you probably don't want to hear it," the woman continued, taking a step closer. "But everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Madison swallowed hard, her throat tightening. The woman's words were simple, but they hit her harder than anything else that had happened in the past few days. What mattered wasn't the past. It wasn't the mistakes she had made. What mattered was the choice she had now. She could continue to blame the world for her fall from grace, or she could face up to the reality of what she had done and try to make things right. The woman smiled gently, then turned and walked away, leaving Madison with her thoughts. She sat there for a long time, her mind racing. Could she change? Could she truly change after everything she had done? For the first time in a long time, Madison felt a glimmer of something other than anger, a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of the world. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. As she stood up and walked back into the shelter, the weight of the sentence still pressing on her shoulders, Madison realized that facing reality wasn't as easy as it seemed. But it was necessary. And for the first time, she was willing to try. Days turned into weeks, and Madison Porter's life continued its sharp descent from the world of luxury to the reality of community service. The once invincible social media queen, who had lived her life believing that money could solve everything, was slowly learning that there were no shortcuts to redemption. Her time spent at the shelter, sorting clothes, cleaning floors, and assisting those she had once dismissed, had become an unexpected form of punishment. But now, it was also her path toward healing. At first, Madison struggled. Every moment felt like an eternity. The young woman, who had once had a life filled with designer bags and private jets, found herself surrounded by people who had none of the privileges she had grown accustomed to. They had no time for the frivolous nature of her past life. They were real, raw, and in need of help, not for show, but for survival. And for the first time, Madison realized the weight of her privilege. Yet it was during these humbling moments that Madison began to see something she hadn't noticed before. The woman she had become wasn't the Madison Porter of social media fame, but someone far more complex. As she worked alongside volunteers, she saw lives that had been impacted by circumstances beyond their control. She began talking with people who had lost everything, some to addiction, others to bad decisions or health crises, but all of them had one thing in common: resilience. Madison had once thought resilience was a trait reserved for those who were less fortunate, but she was slowly discovering that resilience wasn't about money or status. It was about how one carried themselves in the face of hardship, and that, for the first time in her life, was a quality she could learn to respect. It wasn't easy, though. Every time her phone buzzed with a message or notification, a wave of panic would rush over her. The outside world was still talking about her. Gossip about her sentence, her downfall, her fall from grace, continued to flood social media. Her Instagram was a wasteland of angry comments and former fans calling her out. She was no longer the untouchable influencer. She was a target, a punching bag for the masses. But instead of hiding from it like she had done in the past, Madison began responding honestly. In her stories, she apologized to the people she had hurt, the ones whose lives she had recklessly damaged. She shared how her life had taken a turn for the worse, how the weight of her actions finally became clear to her, and while she didn't expect forgiveness, she did it anyway, because she owed it to herself. One evening, as Madison was scrolling through her social media accounts, she saw something unexpected. A message from Teron Walker, the man she had left bleeding in the rain, the man who had been the catalyst for everything that had happened to her. She held her breath as she read it. "I'm not sure what changed you, but I'm glad to see you're trying to be better. You don't have to be perfect, Madison, just honest." Tears welled up in her eyes as she sat there, staring at the message. It was the first time someone she had wronged had shown any kind of understanding. And in that moment, Madison realized something profound. She didn't need to be forgiven by everyone. What mattered was that she was on the right path. She was taking responsibility for her mistakes and trying to make amends. That was the only thing that could ever truly heal the damage she had caused. Her days in the shelter continued, and though they were hard, they were transformative. She still had moments where she longed for her old life, the one filled with money and fame. But those moments became fewer and farther between. She had seen the faces of those who had nothing, who fought daily just to survive. And for the first time, Madison was truly grateful for the opportunity to learn from them. Her father, once a source of power and protection, began calling her less and less. At first, Madison had felt abandoned, like she was being cut off from the only safety net she had known. But as the weeks went on, she started to see it differently. This was no longer a world where daddy's money could fix everything. This was the real world, the world where people had to fight for their worth, for their future, and Madison was ready to fight. One afternoon, as she cleaned a corner of the shelter's small kitchen, Judge Desmond Cole visited the site. The man who had sentenced her. Madison had expected to see disdain in his eyes, but when their gazes met, she saw something different. He didn't look at her with judgment. He looked at her with something like hope. "You're doing good work," Judge Cole said quietly, standing at the door. "This is the beginning of something." Madison didn't know how to respond. She had expected a lecture, or worse, a reminder of her fall from grace. But instead, the man who had been the one to finally hold her accountable was telling her that there was a future for her after all. It was more than she had expected, and it left her feeling strangely hopeful. "Thank you," she said softly. As Judge Cole walked away, Madison stood still for a moment, letting his words sink in. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She still had so much to learn, so many mistakes to fix. But for the first time, she knew she was on the right path. And this time, she wasn't running away from the consequences. She was facing them head-on. And as she wiped away the last of her tears, Madison realized that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And she was ready to take the first step. Now, I invite you to close your eyes, put on your headset, and imagine yourself fully immersed in the world of this story. Let the words paint vivid pictures in your mind, and feel the suspense, excitement, and emotions of every moment. Once you've experienced it, drop a comment and let me know how it felt for you. Was it gripping? Did you feel the tension building up? Share your thoughts with me. I'd love to hear how it affected you.